This is American Political Thought, and this module, which is actually from the last week, which was uh, um, March 1st through 5th, this last week, we lost the week of the syllabus, and I send out the revised reading list of reading and topics, and that's what we'll be following the rest of the semester. So basically, what I'm going to do in this module is to finish up from our introductory week, which was interrupted, and in this module in particular, finish with Cropsey, and in the next module from this last week is to talk about the Declaration of Independence as the kind of platform and container for American politics. And what I want to do in that is look at the Declaration and see how it frames the conceptual rhetoric of American politics, and what that suggests about, for instance, what the next step in the course is, which is to examine the founding. And by founding, again, broadly speaking, we mean the period of construction of our foundational institutions, and to use the Storing books to awaken the nature of that founding as a debate, as we'll see when we turn to Storing, first in our voluntary Zoom sessions on Monday night, tomorrow night, but then as we examine them through the rest of the week. Storing's point about the founding debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, which it shouldn't surprise you, even though, as I pointed out in my American government class, only 19% of American colleges and universities have any kind of history requirement, which generally means that American college students leave college as ignorant of history, both American and world history, as they enter it. Bless their hearts, as they say down here, but not the way they mean it down here. Well, exactly the way they mean it down here. But the Storing's point, and this shouldn't be any news to anybody, is that the Federalists won that debate. But as you'll see, the reason that Storing wants to resurrect that debate is his argument is that American politics is an unfolding of those tensions revealed in the modern debate. So in some ways, the main authors that we're looking at to structure our consideration of American political thought and the American regime, both in some ways, Cropsey, de Tocqueville, Storing, their argument is that there is a certain pattern or unfolding to American politics which is discernible. As we saw with the Cropsey article, the question was is American politics a jumble, an unintelligible jumble with a pattern of unfolding, or is with no discernible pattern of unfolding, or is American politics a comprehensive whole, a comprehensive and comprehensible whole? That is to say, can you look at the whole of American politics and understand its dynamics? And can you see a pattern or a direction to American politics? As I already suggested in our initial consideration of Cropsey, which is why I picked this article to begin the framing of the issues of this course, his answer to both of those questions is yes, there is a comprehensive and comprehensible structure to American politics, and there is a discernible pattern. That's also to some degree Storing's point, as we'll see, and as you'll see, it's also de Tocqueville's point. So, and by the way, that doesn't mean they all three authors and observers agree about the content of American politics, although they roughly do, and the direction that it will unfold, as you'll see as the course unfolds. So let me just start this discussion by reminding you of something I said in the introductory lectures, which is really critical for understanding our examination of American politics and of Cropsey's essay, which is entitled "The U.S. as Regime." And that is the concept of the regime, or constitution, small c. And remember, this is an Aristotelian concept, Platonic Aristotelian. It's the foundational concept, in some ways, of institutional political science. And it's important to see this framework because you're going to see it's actually de Tocqueville's framework too. Although his way of arranging the elements of a regime and discussing them are slightly different, they contain the same thing. So just remember, the four elements of a regime are its foundational principles. And what the purpose of those principles is, what the shared principles of a regime are it's a shared common view of human nature and the understanding of justice that flows from that. Just to put this in framework, in perspective, um, de Tocqueville looks at America in what he considers to be uh, the fundamental turning point in human history. That is to say, the turning point from the aristocratic and within the universe of aristocratic royal politics, which has dominated humanity since the rise of politics 5 to 7,000 years ago, with the foundation of cities and the growth of civilization all around the globe. Um, the transition from uh, the aristocratic template, the foundation of which, the conceptual foundation of which, of course, was human inequality. All the royal lines, all the divine incarnations, all the aristocratic ruling classes all share the presumption that some human beings are superior, either because of the possession of natural virtue or are marked out by divine intention to rule over others. So, but as de Tocqueville points out, we are in the midst of the change to modern democracy, in which the new template for all of politics is, as the Declaration announces, human equality. That all human beings are created equal. So, for American purposes, again, you'll see this when we examine the Declaration. Um, this is a critical difference, and it obviously affects our understanding of justice and how to arrange our institutions and the policies under which we live. So that layer of ideas, and again, you can either conceive of this as a progressive process of ideas to institutions, to laws and policies, to a way of life, which then circle back and reinforce each other. Cropsey somewhat identifies that dynamic. Or you can see it as a kind of a series of concentric circles, where at the core and heart of every regime is a shared view of justice that makes you a French person or an American or a Russian, and then a set of institutions that embody and structure those shared common ideas of human beings, and then policies that those institutions create, and a way of life that hovers over everything. And again, within both of these ways of viewing the elements of a regime, either as a layered process or as concentric circles, the whole point is that the regime is a whole, and all of these elements flow from and affect each other. So, um, the so let's finish up with Cropsey and summarize both his observations and what he has to teach us about American politics that merits his being the first thing we read in this class. So, uh, remember, he begins with the observation that Americans are both the meaning of our life, of our political existence, is a matter of contentious. We don't know what we are. And then the second dynamic he identifies is we don't like what we are. There's this constant ongoing debate about the elements of our regime and the meaning of our politics. And as he says, on the whole, that is not complacent. That there seems to be this constant element of self-criticism or dissatisfaction. Now, so as I said, that eventually opens up to the question, and hence that's why you need the remarkable Cropseyigrams, which uh, uh, elucidate his article in graphic form. Um, and so that unfolds into the question of the ones I mentioned earlier. Is there a wholeness and order to the elements of American political life, and is there an unfolding pattern? And again, as I said, the answer is yes. Now, how does Cropsey find that? Um, he essentially looks to all the elements that have. Well, he turns the question of whether America is a whole or a jumble, a coherent whole or a incoherent jumble. He turns that into a question of where America came from, and that's partially what the Cropseygram is intended to help you understand. Several elements of American life go back much further than the foundation or even the embryonic life of our country. In the colonies, they go back thousands of years, and we'll come back to that, because those elements are what he calls part of the extended regime, or the regime in thought. And the uh, um, and then you'll see that part of that answer is to what America is and how it unfolds, has to do with locating the origin, the core origin, the critical background of American politics in the emergence of modern political philosophy. Um, so, as you'll see, that not only explains why there's an America, uh, uh, we are the conceptual grandchildren of Thomas Hobbes. And if you've read the Cropsey article, and if you've had modern political philosophy, you know what that means. Thomas Hobbes, in his great work, The Leviathan, in 1651, in the middle of the English Civil War, formulated, and this was part of his philosophic reformulation of the political and self-identified vocabulary of human life. It was Hobbes who invented the core elements of modern politics, the foundational concept of rights that finds its embodiment in the Declaration, and then a whole apparatus of other political concepts, that political power derives from the consent of the governed, etc. So uh, the so America exists because these political philosophers wrote their works. And what I meant just a second ago, in terms of America being the grandchildren, of course, Hobbes initiated, and Machiavelli's point, by the way, is that even Hobbes, who was a contemporary with Descartes and Spinoza and Francis Bacon, other great political thinkers and philosophic authorities, the prior generation of modern thought begins with Machiavelli, who himself reorients the whole point in thinking of human life. The way that Cropsey puts this is Machiavelli indicates a terrestrialization of politics, focus away from, as opposed to, of course, what the opposite of terrestrialization is, this celestialization. That with Machiavelli, the call to refocus humanity's life um, solely to life in this world, a secularization, terrestrialization meaning, of course, locating in this world, in this life, in this earth. So, and that is most reflected in the second generation. So Machiavelli initiates his call, and then the second generation of political philosophers in the 1600s, Bacon, Descartes, Hobbes, uh, they formulate this call for secularization and terrestrialization into the core concepts and orientation of modern science and modern politics, which ultimately, as a movement of thought and culture, came to be known as the Enlightenment. So, yes, America is the direct product of this great movement of thought, culture, and science that began in the 1600s and originally in the 1500s, taking it back to Machiavelli, called the Enlightenment. Now, why we are the grandchildren of Hobbes is because Hobbes was extremely controversial in his first generation, and that the next generation of thinkers, especially John Locke and David Hume, Montesquieu in France, um, uh, our founders were educated, because you have to remember the timing. The colonies were founded in 1608, 1620, and Hobbes wrote in 1651. So that caused a ferment in the intellectual world of England, and of course, then the next generation of thinkers that I just mentioned were the ones whom the colonists essentially brought with them in terms of their education in sacred texts. And so the American founders are the grandchildren of Hobbes, in that the core ideas of modern politics that Hobbes formulated are modulated through the second generation, what Cropsey calls classical modernity: life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. Life, liberty, and property. And so the key to his whole essay is that the founding of America, the parchment regime, the official documents of the regime, the layer of ideas, and the core foundational institutions are essentially from that early period of modern thought. And then the rest of his article is to show how the extended regime um, flows from the continuing waves of radicalization and criticism within modern thought. In particular, well, let's pick this apart a little more orderly. If you're looking at the notes from the first week of class, um, so uh, the two dynamics that Cropsey will use to explain American politics are this dynamic of inspiriting and hardening versus the indulging and softening. Um, so his point is, as you look in modern thought, first you have the first great generation of classical philosophers. Let's confine ourselves to Hobbes and Locke, et cetera, et cetera. And then, really, by the time of the Romantic Revolution, which is in the 1750s to the 1850s, and as we'll see, crossed the Atlantic, the Romantic movement in philosophy and culture and thought, and music and art and literature. The great precipitator of this was the first great self-reflective critic of modernity, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And then this second wave of modernity emanates in a great both embrace of the premises of the first wave of modern thought, but then a radicalization. Now, let me just talk about the dynamic of radicalization um, and self-criticism. The word radical, which we have a tendency to mean extreme, more precisely, the word radical comes from radix, root. A radical is somebody that takes a principle and 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 takes it to its intense and absolute root. Now, that can be understood both as a process of purification, but it can also be understood as a process of criticism of existing reality and the complexity of messy and real human beings. And so, as you'll see, Rousseau took the concept of freedom and equality from Hobbes and Locke and Hume, etc., but then radicalized it. And for instance, here's an example of what that means. And again, this is both a self-scrutiny and a criticism or both embrace and rejection of earlier principles. Locke says, for instance, we are all equal and free. Um, and we're really equal by nature, and we're also free in that because we are equal, we are all entitled to our own liberty as natural beings. And the first and primary activity that we use our liberty for, according to Locke, and that's why Locke is the author of Life, Liberty, and Property, is because we use our natural liberty to create the means of our preserving ourselves in this world by generating property. And Locke has this elaborate theory of how, um, as natural beings, whenever you when you grab an apple off a tree, you're both appropriating it, making it yours, but you're also improving its value. So for Locke, creating private property means creating value, and that's why Locke leads to a theory of the free market and everything. He's a proto-capitalist. He's not really a theory of economic capitalism yet, but he provides the concept of private property upon which capitalism and the free market rests, as eventually developed by thinkers like Adam Smith, etc. So, but then understand there's a tension in this. Locke says we are equal by nature in our needs and on our freedom, and we have an equal right to accumulate unequal amounts of property. So, what does Rousseau do with this? And as you're going to see then as modernity unfolds, a modernity and modern political thought is a constant dialogue about freedom and equality, but then pushing the meaning of freedom and equality to ever more radical elements. So, what does, again, this rootization, this radicalization mean? Um, Rousseau argues, for instance, in the second discourse on the origin of human equality, that sounds great, but it means, in other words, that society actually screws up human life because we start out equal, but then because of the unequal amounts of property, because of chance, because of different talents and work, that it turns out that society makes people radically unequal. And so Rousseau has a vision of democratized politics, which also includes, by the way, something like proto-socialism, that you can't say that human beings are equal in nature and then have a society in which they are substantially unequal, especially since property or economic power in Rousseau uh, is the basis of political power. In fact, Rousseau is the first author who argues that politics comes into being so as to preserve exploitative and unequal structures of property. Now, of course, in the third wave of modernity, with Kant and Hegel, the great German philosophers, and Marx especially, um, uh, this 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 attempt to this radical critique of property becomes the Marxian call for an actual abolition of private property in the name of an original equality. So, and Kant radicalizes the freedom of the individual by structuring it as a universal mathematical proposition. For those of you who have read Kant, you've probably heard of the categorical imperative, which is a moral imperative where rational moral behavior is rational behavior, meaning that the rational human being discovers a rule derived from humanity as humanity, a rational proposition which then is applied universally and categorically to all human beings. And so, in some ways, um, there's a radicalization in that the original freedom and equality of human beings becomes the kind of right of society to embody eternal and universal principles of rationality. Now, by the time you get to Hegel, by the way, and I want to mention Hegel, although in my modern political philosophy class we didn't get to Hegel. I don't often include Hegel, but it's important at least for these purposes because, as you're going to see, Cropsey refers to Hegel in the end of his article. Um, the um, with Kant and Hegel, this interesting idea that human history is actually a dialectic, a philosophic dialectic, in which truth is progressively realized. The idea of progress, which, as you're going to see, becomes an element in all modern politics and an element of all modern political rhetoric. Um, uh, and as you'll see in de Tocqueville, when he's delineating American character, I know that you've all heard this in a commercial before: new and improved. The idea that something is improved because it's new and the love of novelty and novelty as progress. These are in some ways implicit in what we call enlightenment and the first stage of modernity, which the argument was universal rational science and politics based on human equality and freedom would eventually replace the superstitious religions of humanity that had led to domination and inequality before. But in the second and third stages of modernity, this concept of progress becomes formulated as the necessary unfolding of history in the direction of, to use Hegel's term, universal and homogeneous state. For Hegel, in other words, all of human history was an attempt on the part of civilization after civilization to discover the divine and philosophic truth of the human condition. And for Hegel, it's again, it must have been a wonderful day in his life when he woke up and realized that his mind, and this is true, Hegel thought that his philosophical system was the summit, the end point of all history, insofar as history was an attempt to discover the truth through an unfolding dialectic. And Hegel argued that once he published, once his mind saw this, the philosophic work of humanity was finished, and that all that was left was for the rest of practical humanity and the actual life of human beings to embody his understanding of universal truth and justice in a world homogeneous state that would embrace all human beings, because now the truth of the human condition had been revealed philosophically by his mind. Well, it wouldn't surprise people coming after Hegel that they didn't exactly agree that Hegel was the end all and be all of human thought and struggle and enlightenment. And in fact, one of the post-Hegelians very quickly then took this notion of historical progress and the ideas of freedom and equality and radicalized them in the Marxian synthesis. And of course, that's Marxism. And in fact, you'd have to say, and you'll see, we'll see this echoing in the various stages of American politics. Really, then, modern thought hovering around the concepts of freedom and equality, in terms of equality, reaches its most radical extension in Marx, and the concept of freedom in existentialism, the sort of other main final branch of modern thought that's kind of playing out. So, that first dynamic is this modernity has and unfolds in waves of successive self-criticism and radicalization of prior ideas. Now, Cropsey also says that this is the other aspect of this dynamic is it starts out inspiriting, but then it ends up indulgent. So, for instance, take Marx. The idea is Marx, workers of the world unite. This kind of spirited call for angry revolution to overthrow the historical aspects of exploitation that capitalism has radicalized and made worse and universal at the same time. A kind of an angry call for action. But then, what it culminates in is this kind of indulgent creation of the universal and homogeneous welfare state where people wait in line for their benefits. So Cropsey suggests that as modernity unfolds and its conceptual elements become purified and radicalized, uh, and when applied to politics, more impatient with existing departures from those radicalized principles, that it moves from trying to inspirit human beings to action in this world, and then ultimately ends up becoming, instead of human beings being active like the scientific conquest of the world under Cartesian science, which you like you sort of see in the opening of the original Star Trek: Space, the final frontier. Let's get out there and discover and charge. And yet, by the time that modernity is done with scientific conquest of humanity, all the adventure has seeped out, and all you're left with is Brave New World, with people waiting in line for their soma pills. So, more about that grim outlook later. So, now the other core dynamic that explains American politics and other practical politics is this second dynamic of popularization and vulgarization. As I mentioned in the last lecture, uh, Americans, de Tocqueville will say, Americans are Cartesians without having read Descartes. We'll see what that means. Meaning they're practical and methodical, and they like to do things if it makes them more money. But the way I left this in the last lecture was Americans are Nietzschean without ever having read Nietzsche. And in some ways, what explains that is and here's another way of framing that question: how did the ideas, these complex and concepts and ideas unleashed in philosophic books, which by the way, never were on the top 10 list of things on Instagram. Not that I've ever seen anything on Instagram anyway. Um, but how did they get from the heads of philosophers and the books of philosophers into the practical arrangements of American politics and to the popular movements that Cropsey says are the extended elements of thought? Um, and that's a question. It's sort of like a trickle down sort of thing. Now, again, um, uh, let's talk about how the American regime came into being. It's not all because all of a sudden billions of copies of Locke's Second Treatise of Government were suddenly, kids woke up on Christmas and found copies of Locke's Second Treatise in their Christmas stockings. But rather, there was a trickle down process by which these books circulated and formed the intellectual climate of their days. And then England, which and modern Europe, which is to some degree was a middle class country, which we'll explore the idea of a middle class country in de Tocqueville. Um, uh, uh, those remember professionals like doctors and engineers and professional scientists and pastors and lawyers and accountants. Those professionally educated individuals went to college and university where these philosophic books were circulating. And so, in some ways, it's through that process of the intellectual climate being. So, it turns out the universities actually do, in fact, direct the world. Um, and then, of course, the pastors and the lawyers and the teachers then disseminated those concepts. And in fact, you could say in the American Revolution, or the civil rights struggle, by the way, with many of the dissemination of the core concepts occurred in the churches of colonial America and in the churches in the African American churches, which became a kind of a transition point between the formulation of these concepts and their dissemination, etc. So, so to some degree, even though the founders of this country, by and large, the people that attended the Constitutional Convention were college educated, by that time, these philosophic ideas had not only um, transitioned downwards and been filtered, and therefore acceptable and widespread among the populace. So, for instance, uh, um, in the American Revolution in January of 1776, Thomas Paine, who was something of a philosophic author and wrote several philosophic texts, um, uh, published a pamphlet which was one of the most widely disseminated publishing events in American history, Common Sense. And when you read Common Sense, it's kind of like there's that series of books like Calculus for Dummies. Um, Common Sense is kind of Locke for everyday Americans, and the publication of this pamphlet kind of crystallized and provided the political framework for the dissatisfaction of the Americans with their colonial masters. So, and as we'll see, that partially explains how, if you're looking at the Cropseyian, all these elements of philosophers, especially the ones who wrote and published and were influential after the founding of America, how did they come to be part of American life? Well, of course, the main way was immigration, because here's a shocker. Europe is like 3,000 miles away across the Atlantic Ocean, which in some ways always had created a kind of a buffer uh, for many of these radical movements of both politics and philosophy, which would flood over Europe. There was this kind of 3,000 miles of ocean, but of course, eventually that was broken down. And of course, would it be broken down in an age of universal communication? So, so the so the second part of explaining how the ideas of political philosophers become elements in American popular thought, culture, and politics is this filtering down, but then also Cropsey says is a process of vulgarization and simplification. So most Americans probably wouldn't recognize the will to power, which is one of the core Nietzschean concepts, especially in his later philosophies. If I said, well, the thrust of this legislation is the will to power, blah, 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 they wouldn't understand that. But my guess is most Americans in our time, and by our time, I mean both my time and your time, have heard the expression, you can't impose your values on somebody else, you can't legislate morality. Those popular vulgarized expressions are in fact just that. They are popularized, absorbed, and in some ways cruder versions of the idea of existential authenticity, self-creation through the transvaluation of all values, etc., core Nietzschean terms and elements of, say, Heideggerian philosophy and existentialism. So for Cropsey, there you have it. So let's look at the elements of the regime, and kind of lay out his framework then, and see where this goes and what it may reveal about American political life and the future of American politics. So okay, so uh, so Cropsey notes, for instance, that one of the surprising things is that how much we disagree over because the meaning of our politics, because we have these central parchments like the Declaration and the Constitution. Remember, every nation has core ideas and institutions and all these things, these elements of the regime that I talked about. But America was the initiator of modern politics in some ways in 1776. And prior to that, to some degree, with the Mayflower Compact, in that we attempted to create and stabilize our foundational moment in a document. And again, we have the twin documents of the Declaration and, of course, originally the Articles and the Constitution. So that's what he calls the parchment regime, our official regime. Now, there is an element to American politics which is kind of implicit in this encrustation of initial modernity, and that is the limited constitution, the idea of limited government. Now, to put this again against the background of political philosophy, you could say that the modern political philosophers, this terrestrialization that I mentioned earlier by Machiavelli, the secularization of the aim of politics, where politics is no longer to prepare us for the next world or to save our souls, even if it meant burning our bodies to save our souls. But now, as Locke says, the purpose of politics is a safe and comfortable existence in this world. So you'd have to say that that this initial thrust of modern political philosophy as a reaction against the ancient world was an attempt to limit first the scope and then the power of government on the grounds that ancient politics, the ancient politics of aristocratic nobility, of princely ambition, of salvational faith, um, uh, turned all politics into totalitarianism. Hence the Inquisition or whatever. And that the initial thrust of modern political philosophy was to limit politics in its scope, first with the separation of church and state, and then the whole creation of a broad private realm where politics would be limited in its agenda to a few things like providing the conditions of the enjoyment of liberty, but not actually dictating what the content of private liberty is. That first notion of limited government, but by the time you got to the American founding, the awareness that even a purely secular aim to politics could still have totalitarian implications, which, by the way, the 20th century, you could say, one bitter and horrible and horrifying lesson of the 20th century is it turns out that even if you have completely secular politics, atheistic politics, like the Nazis and the communists, you can still have monstrous and tyrannical regimes. So the second part of limited government, which the framers of this country especially were engaged in, was to create not only a government of limited scope with a limited agenda, leaving the most of private life that had been priorly in America in world history had been politicized as part of the regime, to restrict politics to that small agenda of providing the conditions of private security and liberty, um, and moreover to create a structure of institutions which would indeed limit the power of government for the sake of attaining that limited agenda. Now, that means, in other words, to put this back in Cropsey's terms, we were the first regime where the regime tried not to be the entirety of human life and to leave the rest of human life to the private realm. But as he points out, that turns out, in this attempt to put it in documents to stabilize and permanentize the limited character of government. But the problem is then when you leave unregulated, and our First Amendment says we leave religion, private thought, every publication unregulated, that means the regime then has a kind of a mind of its own as thought unfolds. So the real whole of American politics, WHOLE, is you have this structure of classic modernity, of limited government in aims and in powers, but then the engine of its moving forward after its founding, embodying the agenda of life, liberty, and property of that classical Hobbesian and Lockean moment, or Adam Smithian moment, with the free market and private property. Those are so our parchment regime is an attempt to stabilize and concretize and permanentize that initial moment. But then what happens politically is the extended regime beyond the self-imposed limits nevertheless carries on and develops. And that's where then to find out the fullness of American politics and to predict the unfolding of American politics, you have to look at the two prior elements of the regime, uh, and then you have to look at the subsequent elements of the regime. The prior elements of the regime that formed much of the filling out of the private and extended regime was, of course, Christianity, and as he discusses, science. Um, Now, as he points out, by the way, um, uh, and I'll just make a parenthetical comment about science in a minute, but Christianity, of course, became profoundly modulated as it became blended with subsequent dimensions, and this is true of Judaism too, by the way. It hasn't quite happened to Islam, but there's no question that Judaism and Christianity in the Western world have been profoundly refounded and reoriented, as he says, tamed, where we don't believe in burning people because they're the wrong religion or the wrong understanding of religion. They've been tamed because they become blended with subsequent waves of modern thought, either John Stuart Mill's, the idea of liberty, that you're free to do whatever you as long as you don't hurt anybody else, or existential authenticity, or even socialism. So science is a little bit different, because there is a certain sense in which modern politics originated at the same time modern science. And Cropsey doesn't necessarily go in this direction, but as we're going to see, the unfolding of science and the progressive conquest of natural motion in the name of human power, that's the thrust of Baconian and Cartesian science, that itself creates new moments in American politics. So, for instance, the whole question of national health care, or, say, transgenderism, that couldn't exist in a universe where modern science had not already assumed a sort of power to control and direct natural motion according to human power, which of course was the thrust of the modern scientific revolution. To know the laws of nature, as Descartes says in part 6 of the Discourse on Method, we need a new science, not like the old theological one, directed towards meditating on God's universe and the creation, but a new practical science by which, knowing the motions of the planets and the stars and the bodies all around us, we could learn how they work and make ourselves, as it were, masters and possessors of nature. And so, in some ways, as that scientific project has unfolded, I mean, after all, first, don't forget that these guys wrote their books, like Descartes and Hobbes, in 1526 and in 1637. 1626 and 1637, the Discourse on Method and the Advancement of Learning by Bacon, the two great founders of modern science. And you can say, what's this point? What would be the scientific version of the political process we talked about, where Hobbes publishes Leviathan and Locke the second in 1651, and Locke the second treatise in 1688, and then that leads to America. What's the scientific version of the unleashing and foundation of modern science and the subsequent transformation of the human world? Well, it's 1733 Arkwright, the invention of the steam engine and the application to factory labor that begins the Industrial Revolution. And then, of course, electricity, and then modern communication, and then the computer, and then the internet. And of course, in 2004, the publication of the human genome. So the scientific project of creating human power over nature has also led to moments in American politics which couldn't have existed earlier, because, for instance, modern medicine, which presumes the successfulness of medicine. But you know that prior to the 1840s and the 1880s, like before the discovery of germ theory of disease, and before the discovery of anesthetics and anesthesia and antiseptics, and modern techniques of surgery and scientific research, medicine was a hit or miss proposition, where, George Washington was probably killed by his doctors by cupping and bleeding. And so, in some ways, you couldn't imagine, for instance, a political movement dispensing modern healthcare as a right unless the medical establishment, because of its scientifically evolving successfulness, could promise some benefit. You probably wouldn't want a national healthcare system that consisted of cupping and bleeding people. But again, the same with transgender. Now, with transgenderism, that's where, for instance, and aspects of personal identity based on biology, or freed from biology, I should say, that's where Cartesian science and modern existentialism converge, where the idea is each person creates his or her own identity, and that modern science then turns the material elements of our body into the clay out of which the individual constructs. So you can see scientific progress and existentialism combine there. So anyway, those are the two pre-existing elements. And of course, the reason they became part of our regime is because the colonies were, in fact, Christian colonies, English Christian colonies. And you could say, by the way, that these two prior elements of the American regime were present in all modern life. Again, towards the end of his essay, Cropsey says American politics and the American regime is this giant embodiment of the dynamic of modernity unfolding, but so is every regime which has existed prior to, unless you're talking about some isolated element of the human race which is immune from the successive development of modern industry and revolutionary conditions of the human life, and modern science and modern communication. But of course, we know that it's true that not only is the human race kind of merging globally conceptually, but literally science is creating a global humanity. So there is a certain sense in which what Cropsey identifies as the dynamic of American politics is the dynamic of all politics today, all modern politics. And you'll see de Tocqueville points also in that direction. So the subsequent elements of the regime um, have to do with the fact, okay, so America is founded, becomes a practical political entity in 1776, and already to some degree, and you'll see some of the Rousseauian critique of of Lockean limited constitutionalism with private property already has crossed the Atlantic even at the time of the American founding. And to some degree, that Rousseauian critique of inequality that the free market or capitalism generates already begins to seep into, as we'll see, some of the anti-federalist thought. Um, but of course, the early 1800s was this great, what was called the Transcendentalists. But the Transcendentalists in American literature, art, and philosophy, like Emerson and Thoreau, etc., they were in fact the American embodiment of the Romantic movement. So already this modern dynamic of radicalization, critique of former elements, and the attempt to perfect through absolutization or radicalization becomes part of American culture. So and this shows not only in the Rousseauian and Kantian and Hegelian notion of community and equality, where you find the elevation of sentiment over calculation. And by the way, you could say in in at least my lifetime, this emerged in the 1960s as the hippie and the greening of America, which was in fact a kind of a radical romanticization of American life. But of course, the greater call for centralization, which the Tocqueville will point about, we'll talk about quite a bit, and the greater expansion of the welfare state is a successive embrace of the sort of Marxian socialist critique of earlier modernity. Now, uh, he also then points out that existentialism, then, which is so if Marxism, if Hegelian Marxism socialism points towards community provision, socialism, etc., replacing the earlier individualism and inequality, existentialism takes this other wing of modern thought, the equality and the liberty, and radicalizes liberty, where the essence of every individual is to create his or her own values and valuational universe. And you can see that again, as I already suggested, with the idea that the American idea that you can't legislate morality, which means that everyone has to create his or her own morality. Now, he also talks a bit about psychoanalysis, and that probably might have been the most surprising element in his discussion. You might not have been expecting to see Freud pop up there. But as you're going to see, Freud did have an important element in terms of undermining the claims of traditional morality as an objective measure, and instead the idea that the human being is simply an economy of repressed sexual desires. That once Freudianism then became popularized, the idea that well, then the Freudian notion of we live in social life because we have to repress our animal, especially our sexual instincts, all of a sudden, as it becomes lowered, vulgarized, and popularized, it becomes do your own thing, and that in some ways, the freedom from oppression of instinctual urges becomes merged with this existential personal liberty. So, for Cropsey, that explains why you couldn't have had, say, the New Deal in 1840. It explains why you couldn't have had a debate about national health care in 1890. It explains why, even though you had suffragette movements, and because aspects of human equality because don't forget, the beginning of the first piece of feminist literature was in 1792, the vindication of the rights of women, which actually come from the same classical modernity that America comes from. But nevertheless, you couldn't have the discussions of women's liberation and other kinds of personal liberation in the late 1900s and early 2000s without that successive radicalization and combining with other elements that I've already talked about. So that's how we get to, that's where America comes from. what its elements of a regime are, and why Cropsey thinks American politics is a whole rather than a jumble, and why its unfolding is predictable. Um, so, um, uh, so that's the last question I want to leave with Cropsey. He may or may not be wrong about this, right about this, but if you're looking at the last page of the notes from the first week, this is the question I think that Cropsey raises, and you'll see to some degree Storing and de Tocqueville also raise this as we gaze into the future and coming centuries of American politics. So this is from Roman numeral 6 on the last page of the notes. If the content and direction of American politics comes from the successive and decaying elements of modern political philosophy drifting down into the popular consciousness of Americans, then wafting up into the institutions and policies of the parchment regime, what's the future? And Cropsey has already suggested, who has a kind of a tragic and kind of a pessimistic view of human life anyway, probably suggests a pretty pessimistic end to American politics. What does he see possibly coming? A drab and trivialized Marxism and existentialism, playing itself out in the petty and private atomized lives of empty human beings uh, who, who, who vomit the contents of their trivialized and bizarre private lives into YouTube and Instagram, and cared for all of that uh, um, uh, private element cared for and superintended by a centralized welfare state. A kind of a mixture of Clockwork Orange, 1984, and Brave New World, and Idiocracy, if you've seen Idiocracy. Now, Cropsey does end the last line of his article. Our prospects for the third century of American politics seem to depend upon we discovering new elements of political life in the spirited wells of modernity. But if he's right about the overall situation of American politics in modern thought, there is a certain sense in which modern philosophic thought ends up in nihilism and relativism, and in some ways suggest a broad decay of politics that will follow. Now, if that's really the future of America, none of us really knows. But what I think Cropsey adds to our understanding is he does make us see, uh, in relative philosophic and historical perspective, the elements of American political life, where they came from, how they came to be blended, how they work with each other, and what may in fact be the likely outcome. A question to which we will return both with Storing and the debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and de Tocqueville.